Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the January 23rd iteration of the Militarized Equipment Ad Hoc. I am Commissioner Shea, and we are joined tonight by members of the department, 3 commissioners, as well as some members of the public who are experts on the local ordinance and these new laws. We are also joined by Commission Counsel Dwi Nguyen. And so thank you all for being here and taking the extra Monday out of your lives to work on these policies. For today's purposes, we're still going through the proposed amendments that City Council has sent to us from the January 17th meeting. I thought I would start us off with I-26 robots because it's relatively uncontroversial. I think they proposed amendments, and then take us through to some of the other amendments that we have, two that we have not yet gotten to, and one that is still unresolved from our last meeting. Does that sound okay? Great. In terms of timing, I will let everyone know that it's anticipated that the Police Commission will agendize these policies for our Thursday meeting on the 26th, and that's so that we can get a rapid turnaround and broader public participation and viewing for these policies in order to meet our deadlines for the mid to end of March for the City Council. So look forward to those policies coming back on Thursday. Any questions, thoughts, or comments before we begin? Hearing none, I will get started. So from the City Council and their proposed resolution, there were a couple of amendments specific to the robots policy, but in the gist of them were to make it very clear that robots and their attachments shall not be deployed as a use of force, regardless of the attachment, and as well as removing the chemical OC spray from its use. And since the OC spray can only be used as a use of force, that would remove it completely from being used as part of the robot attachments. We heard from the department last week that there are no objections or issues with this particular proposal or these proposed amendments. Does anybody from the department want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I could speak on behalf of that. I spoke to Chief Allison about this. We're perfectly fine with it. We've never deployed it in real life scenarios. Obviously, we've only done it during training exercises. So I'm totally fine with it. The only thing was, if you could scroll down, just double checking the footnote or the end note. Yeah, we're totally fine with that. I was okay with it.
Okay. And this is Lieutenant Dazakuros, who is running the robots and pole cameras, as well as the drone program. Okay, so I know what I did was slightly different than what the City Council did, mainly because they proposed to add a line 7, which added that robots and their attachments shall not be deployed as a use of force. I felt that that was rather clunky with the explicit callouts for the robotic arm and the pan disruptor and the glass tire puncture. So what I did was I removed the 2 sections here about the robotic arm and the detachable pan disruptor and the puncture, and then just collapsed everything into item 4, which is a little bit higher up, and I'll show the rest of the section, which is the prohibited use section. That for number 4, robot, sort of a very blanket statement, robots and their attachments shall not be deployed as a use of force on a person, with a definition of force and a reference to DGOK 3. And I upgraded it from a footnote to a separate line item, that it's not a violation of this policy to use the robot arm to push, poke, or pull a person to gain their attention, nor is it a violation to grab or pull them with the robotic arm in an attempt to rescue them from a dangerous situation. And then still have the very specific call out of not loading the detachable pan disruptor with a live ammunition round. Thoughts, questions? Anybody like it better the other way? Completely open, just a thought.
I'm totally fine with it.
Okay. Just to show everything, we also have the above section here about the detachable OC canister. I still am crossing out all of the things that are there that were suggested by the proposed amendments, mainly because they become superfluous language at this point. Okay. Any other thoughts on these proposed amendments for robots? Great. Okay. If anyone thinks of anything, mention something, say something before we finish off this meeting, but thank you for your patience. Let me turn to the next one. Okay. Can we turn to case 6, patrol rifles? Is that okay? Great, thank you. So I don't have the full document up, but I've tried to reproduce. This is where we were at the end of our last meeting. What we have here are a set of alternatives under the section under authorized deployment.
Could you make it just a little bit larger?
I'll do what I can. Give me 1 second. Oh. Yeah. How's that?
Much better. Thanks.
Okay. And so we are talking here about this paragraph here, which is paragraph 4. Paragraph 4, as it stands right now, is the exact language from the proposed proposed amendment from City Council, and we discussed a number of factors and issues, and I have come up with these 3, what I think are 3 different realistic different alternatives to what we have in number 4. The first one calls out specifically that it's commanders and officers and shall make reasonable efforts to avoid the deployment of patrol rifles. Alternative 2 just says avoiding the deployment of patrol rifles, and has it without the subjects who do that because it's in the authorized deployment section. And alternative 3 was suggested by now acting Chief Allison, to create a new section that requires that officers and patrol rifle officers consider reasonable alternatives to patrol rifle deployment as part of their considerations. Thoughts, comments, questions from anyone here? Mr. Lindsay Poland.
They're very similar. But from my reading, the first two are more clear about what the meaning of these factors are. The question I guess I have, I believe it was Commissioner Jackson Chastain, and this also might be a question for the commission's attorney, is what difference the reasonable efforts makes. Like I think there's probably some legal definition of reasonable that might have some implications I'm not aware of. But I would just say from my reading, I think the first two are more clear in terms of what the intent is.
Lieutenant Turner.
Yeah, I do tend to agree. I think that you know, it might get a little buried when we took a look at like alternative 3 and having that in there. Reasonable efforts, I think, you know, and maybe even, yeah, when we talk about in the first alternative, the immediate presence, we've kind of pared down a little bit of that sort of overarching presence, which is an issue for the department, and then the efforts, which reasonable, and we would probably stay around the same standard that we use currently for reasonable officer, or you know, considering the training experience and their position as a police officer, which would be different than say a reasonable person who might not have the same training or expertise. However, I think those, all of them are fine. I think the department can probably work through any of these, but I do tend to agree with Mr. Lindsay Pullen that probably the first two are a little more clear about what it is that it seems we're trying to do, which is kind of in line with the department's de-escalation initiative around trying to, for everyone, but especially for vulnerable populations, limit the amount of force we are using on them, around them, to them, to try and resolve situations where they are involved.
I want to highlight the difference between what we have between number 4 that's currently there as the proposed amendment, and let's take alternative 1. And I think that it's the two things that were mentioned, and I'm starting to also tend to agree with them, those things that were mentioned at the last ad hoc, which is one, a bit of a chilling effect on the deployment of patrol officers who have patrol rifles will be sitting there thinking and making sure that they have considered every single possibility, which may delay tactical response, may cause them to just not deploy, which may very well be the intent of number 4. That I don't have as big of a problem as much as what Commissioner Jordan mentioned, I think, on the back end, which is when we say shall make every effort, a lawyer like me, who might be maybe a more creative lawyer, perhaps, will think of every single possible alternative. And if they can think of one that an officer has not thought of, that is a violation of number 4. Right. And that is a little concerning. I think that is a little bit concerning in that may, again, be another one of those things that may just be a complete chilling effect when the deployment of the rifles could be done with very good reason and with many public safety concerns at hand and being considered. I think that alternative 1, really any of these, but probably focusing more on alternative 1, is a balance, is probably the best we can get to that balance and still hold officers accountable, because what they will be looking at would be, or what would be looked at would either be reasonable efforts, either from a more senior investigator in the Internal Affairs Division or from a CPRA investigator, thinking about what whether or not those commanders or officers did in fact make reasonable efforts to avoid the deployment. I'll shut up now. Vice Chair?
Yeah, I spent some time thinking about this after the last meeting, and I still sort of feel as though that reasonable effort should be to ascertain whether any of these vulnerable populations are indeed present or at risk. And I think the continued language should I think it should be a make every effort, as opposed to reasonable effort, to ascertain if a vulnerable population is in proximity, or however we want to phrase that, or present. And the following should be something like, and maybe there is this sort of like, make all efforts to reduce harm, any potential harm to any member of this vulnerable population, up to and including not deploying patrol rifles, if that is really the sort of best way to do it. It is on the table as a sort of like factor. So that might be, there are lots of ways to reduce harm. You could evacuate those members of a vulnerable population. You could choose to, if it is a pre-planned operation, you can choose to postpone or reposition or something along those lines. Presumably, there are options available, and one of those options may be not deploying them if it is feasible. I mean, if there's imminent risk to people's lives and the rifles need to be deployed, it has to be balanced out against the potential harm to bystanders, or even the subject of as we discussed, the subject of the deployment may be somebody who's part of this vulnerable population. Because they are a member of this vulnerable population doesn't necessarily mean they may not harm somebody else. And so I think there's, we don't want to just think of these people as simply victims, even if we still want to be concerned about their well-being. They could be, in fact, the person who is the subject of the deployment, unfortunately. That's my thought, is that we should, the language should really focus on like the efforts to identify whether they're there, and then the continued effort to decide whether to deploy the rifle or not in their presence. I feel like that is getting to the specifics that does not leave us in a position of it not being enforceable because it's too broad, or B, it being enforceable or causing that chilling effect and causing officers to not react more quickly because they are concerned about a policy that may or may not affect them in the moment. And also, as Jesse was saying, that it is entirely possible that a sort of alternative interpretation of broad language can be used for disciplinary means, but maybe that's not the intent. I know the department hates to have things that are very specific, and sometimes it locks us in, but I feel like in this situation, being specific is helpful.
A very interesting focus and thought. It actually does make some sense. Ms. Tu?
I'll preface by saying John might disagree with me on this one. I am wondering, as I listen to Commissioner Jordan, if adding any kind of language about addressing a immediate threat to life or a serious bodily injury would change the original language in a way that would be satisfactory to all. And then the other separate thing I am wondering is I feel like I don't really understand what legal implications there are for the word reasonable. And I'm hoping someone in here can shed some light on that.
Okay, thoughts about a public safety exception, and then about the legal ramifications of reasonable.
So I think from the perspective of the department, it sounds like everyone's kind of on the same page, which is that we're attempting to have at all times de-escalation tactics and techniques at any time when force could be used, regardless of whether that's a rifle, whatever. That we have de-escalation, we have a de-escalation policy, and trying to stay within the spirit of that. And then that furthermore, even just the presence of these rifles in either with a person that we are engaging with who is a vulnerable person, or members of the community that are vulnerable people, that there are some negative effects around that we're trying to reduce. And the department typically does, and I think we've, from our comments, kind of focus on the person that we are engaged with, because it is less easy for us to control the environment within which we act. We do and can sometimes, especially as things are more pre-planned, but then and I think this is one of the issues that the assistant chief was worried about with these rifles and the way that the department is working, that we typically are responding to crimes in progress or attempting to apprehend someone who is wanted for a violent crime, and we have much less control over the environment within which we work. That being said, the public safety exception, I think, is something that, or an idea of public safety being something, it was when it would be unreasonable to make an effort, for instance, or to remove the rifle, because public safety is the thing that we are taking these rifles out for. So it sounds like, I mean, and when we talk about, and sort of dovetails into the idea of reasonable, is reasonable is typically, or at least when we teach, when weighing the benefits against the harms, that we're trying to reduce the number of harms and increase the number of benefits. And sometimes the presence of these weapons does tend to either reduce harm or increase the benefit for the officer. And so the idea of being a public safety emergency, or where that person, even if they are a member of a vulnerable population, is the suspect in a crime, or is engaged in activity which is dangerous to the community, to the officers, then that is something where it would be unreasonable for them to act. So yeah, I think that we are in a little bit. I appreciate what Commissioner Jordan said about us, that we don't know who a person is necessarily from, and I think that's what you're, and correct me if that's not what you're trying to say, but kind of, we don't know necessarily who that person is. We do have to base a lot of our decisions on the things that they exhibit, the outward sort of appearances or actions. We can't necessarily know sometimes, but that I think hopefully we're all trying to get towards that same place, which is the idea of de-escalation and bringing that to this tool.
Mr. Lindsay Pullen.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, what I understand from what Lieutenant Turner said about reasonable is that there's a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. I guess I do think that it's kind of implicit that if there's a threat to life, that's going to be part of the consideration. But I like Commissioner Jordan's suggestion, because it gets at, okay, I am an officer, I have to avoid deploying in this presence, but what do I know? And in fact, this is essentially saying not just that officer, but the commander or the incident commander, whoever is, making the decisions, if it's a team, needs to try to ascertain that. And for pre-planned ops, I think that's especially feasible and important. And so I really like that, because I think it kind of gets at something that a lot of these policies don't get at, which is what's the intel going into the decision. And so I don't know what the exact language would need to be, but I like this sort of, she'll make every reasonable or make a reasonable efforts or every effort, whatever, to ascertain and then avoid, or reasonable efforts to avoid or whatever, but that it's again a value statement, right? If once you've ascertained that some of these folks might be there, then it's an important variable in the decisions. And I also like the idea of like even saying will then could mean that alternatives include postponement, evacuation, not deploying, whatever, so I like that language. And I do note there's a member of the public who has their hand up.
Commissioner Jordan.
Actually, let's hear what the member of the public has to say before I weigh back in. I'm good with that.
They put their hand down, but if they put their hand back up, there it is. Okay. Leilani Bay Peace, giving you ability to talk.
Hello, folks. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Leilani. I'm the director at Bay Peace. Our organization was a part of the initial efforts of pushing the ordinance through. A thought Commissioner Jordan earlier mentioned, the possibility of these populations being the person who they might be in pursuit of. So also another thought or suggestion might be not only to consider the immediate presence of this particular population, but the immediate presence of non-threatening members of this population. And also, just want to sort of like second that I do think the idea of reasonable efforts is fair, just so that it may be taken into consideration, like the commanding officer, the commanders or officers, like level of training and knowledge. I do think it's important that they make I do sort of think it's important that they make every effort to like ascertain or develop the intel to where they do know these things, especially in pre-planned operations, but also understand the need to consider when there may be situations that are a little more urgent and are like more immediate responses. But yeah, those were the only comments I had. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Any other members of the public? Vice Chair.
Yeah, I mostly I just wanted to speak to the idea of what is reasonable as sort of how it's defined. And this is a thing that we've sort of come up, not come up against, but sort of run into multiple times in many of the policies, whereas sort of like and often that is the standard, or especially around like disciplinary issues, sort of reasonable decision making given the totality of the information available in the moment, especially in those situations that are not pre-planned operations, but even those. And so I think that we can sort of add that in as a standard here, that is, you know, that reasonable effort given the information available. Because I do think about the things like, you know, Jennifer mentioned last time around, you know, if you have the subject of a rifle deployment who, you know, does not speak the language that the officer who is, you know, ordering them to, you know, to whatever speaks, one would assume that, you know, weapons drawn officers, you know, a person regardless of language would understand what that meant. But, you know, let's not, I think assumptions sometimes in policy game are dangerous, regardless of which direction you're going. But, you know, whether they speak the language, whether they are, you know, whether they hear or can speak, whether they, you know, are, you know, sort of emotionally decompensated in some respect, and not, you know, not actually sort of seeing the reality of the world in the same way that the officers are seeing it. I think that it is reasonable to expect an officer to sort of in the moment to try and ascertain, but not at the risk of, you know, public safety. And I think that is, you know, I think that is a reasonable expectation. I think that's the thing we can ask here. I think, you know, a very broad sort of like, don't do it if any of these people are around, is maybe too broad on both sides. I don't think it gets to the thing we want, that increases public safety for people who may be harmed by patrol rifles. It also doesn't allow for, you know, the police to potentially do their job in maintaining public safety in situations where there is, you know, a risk, you know, people's lives at risk. And so, but I think that we often hear that sort of reasonable, and we can look back at a variety of policies, and maybe Lieutenant Turner has insight into, like, because I know that this is the thing that I've literally heard Lieutenant Turner explain, or some other command staff explain, sort of like what that looks like, what people's expectation of the term reasonable, you know, in this respect is.
Yeah, I think if I could just add to that, I think that's absolutely accurate. And you know, when we talk about reasonable officer and what reasonableness is, I think we have had, especially in the policies that have been created so far through processes like these, added on expectations of a reasonable Oakland police officer, which are, you know, by sort of a somewhat sometimes contentious, but a sort of give and take process, really narrow down to the focus of what it is that we expect the officers to do, and that they can complete successfully. So when we think about things like the de-escalation policy that is in our general order on force, and the way that we have the force in there, that is something that is reasonable for an Oakland police officer. And I think that the body of sort of understanding grows each time that we do this. So I do agree that it's not going to be perfect. Also, that we will see other examples of this idea of the reasonable standard, where, and this is especially true when you're talking about Supreme Court jurisprudence or videos from other jurisdictions, or things where in other states where that standard is much lower. However, I think that the CPRA, IA, the police commission in a discipline committee or anything like that does a good job of asking, what is it that we train? What does the policy, and looking at evidence such as this, where we are trying to find what that is, understand a shared goal, which in this case is de-escalation, protecting members of these vulnerable populations, and protecting our community from public safety threats. And then how do we get there? And when we have officers making thoughtful decisions towards those goals, that it goes a long way towards reasonableness, and that things like the amount of time available to make a decision go into reasonableness as well.
So I'm gonna, as you all have probably been watching, I've been live making edits, and I want everyone's thoughts on alternative 1, if possible. Mainly because I'm not quite sure where people fall on the first part, the ascertaining, whether that should be every effort or some other standard. Or rather, I think people have said where, but whether we have consensus about what that is.
I would maybe change one thing. I would swap every effort at the top in the first section to reasonable effort, and I would change and move every down to the second section under every effort. If present commanders shall make every effort to avoid. I don't know.
Sorry. So
oh, maybe
let me
maybe,
explain. Yeah. Every effort to ascertain presence, and then reasonable efforts to avoid the deployment.
Yeah, no, I'm after saying this and reading through it again, I think you're right. I think the way you have it there is actually preferable. Sometimes we just look at these things and they stop. You look at it so long, you bounce the words around your head so long, it kind of stops making you heads or tails of it. But no, I think this is good.
Lieutenant Turner.
I think that this is good. The only thing I would say is that in the first around effort, I would probably say reasonable effort. That, you know, as you mentioned earlier, every effort does kind of invite some challenges, especially when we're talking about things that are rapidly developing, uncertain and dangerous. However, understanding that, and I think ascertain the presence, perhaps if we're talking about understand who that person is in front of us or something like that. I get where we're going. I just want to make sure that we set the staff up with an expectation that it can successfully attain.
Commissioner Jackson Castaigne.
Yeah, I agree with Lieutenant Turner. I'm not really fond of every effort in the first sentence, only because to me that implies that you kind of stop what you're doing and you focus on trying to identify these people. And I just don't think it's realistic. I think every effort would include something like potentially asking the folks there or at the, you know, the scene if they have a mental or intellectual disability, and it applies like another level of rigor to, I think, their decision-making process that might limit their ability to actually execute the job at hand. So I would prefer to not see every effort in that first sentence, and I like the second sentence.
Other thoughts? I don't suppose it makes a difference if I say every reasonable effort, does it? Probably not.
I thought that was a interesting approach.
I kind of like it.
It's redundant.
I agree with Commissioner Jackson Castaigne. I think that is kind of what I was responding to, but I sort of lost track of my line of thought there, and I fully agree with what you're saying.
I'm trying to understand what the difference would be between alternative 1 and if you went up to number 4 above it and change that to commanders and officers shall make every / plus reasonable effort.
I think so. The difference between alternative 1 and 4 is that there is a specific call out. There's this, sorry, let me first explain what the weird symboling that I have here. The slash is alternative, either every or reasonable, and then the plus was in consideration of maybe possibly both. The difference between 4 and alternative 1, in my mind, when I read through it, is that it adds an extra step. It adds an extra step, and that extra step is what I think you were actually mentioning at the last ad hoc, that what we want is for officers, and especially patrol rifle officers, to stop and think and look and try to determine who is here. Are there any of the people here that would be more negatively impacted than other people at the presence of an assault rifle? To sort of take that second and look around and see and try to develop some intelligence if they can, and then to move on to the task at hand. Whereas number 4 doesn't necessarily make that call out and make that statement of like, this is what needs to be done, this is what we want done. Stu?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for making that distinction. Or sorry, for walking us through the distinction. One thing that makes me a little bit hesitant is I like the making it clear that the goal is to check for the presence of these vulnerable populations. And I'm wondering if the adjective reasonable is added to effort in that first sentence, if that would be very easy to skip over. I'm wondering if an officer arrives at a scene, if it would be reasonable that their attention would be directed to the purpose that they for which they want to deploy a patrol rifle, and if it would be reasonable to not ascertain the presence of these vulnerable populations. So I'm hoping we can have some discussion about that. I also note that there are members of the public with their hands raised.
Before we get to the next hands, maybe if Lieutenant Toribio is here, he could tell us how or what it is that patrol rifles officers would be trained to do with this particular call out, or perhaps what relevant training they currently are getting.
Yeah, good afternoon. Sorry, I'm really fighting a cough right now. It falls in line. I think I may have kind of mentioned this before. So the rifle, it's a tool like other force option tools, and what we consistently teach when deploying the rifle or any tool is to consider the totality of circumstances and that plays a factor into your decision making for the tool that you're using. So we look at the specific benefits that the rifle offers, which is distance and accuracy. And we can get into a little bit more specifics, like if somebody's wearing body armor and with the actual projectile of the rifle being more conducive to stopping a threat if somebody's wearing body armor. So there's that. What kind of sets the rifle apart a bit like it does with any firearm, is that it's considered lethal force. So in these situations, what ends up weighing most is the potential exists that we're going to need to use a tool that by design is intended to cause serious injury. So it becomes as close as anything, I suppose, to being a binary deployment, meaning is there high potential here that I'm going to have to use a tool that causes serious injury or death. And when that line or that judgment is made that that exists, then we're going to draw our firearm or we're going to deploy the rifle. And because of the severity of those circumstances are so high, it kind of it makes it it kind of supersedes a lot of other considerations. And I know that maybe can kind of sound harsh, right? So, we're looking to obviously consider the detrimental effects that the mere sight of a rifle has. But now we're in a situation where we believe that we may have to use lethal force and that this tool is going to give us an advantage because of the distance or the accuracy involved. And then once that line is kind of crossed, or once that judgment is made for it, we're going to opt to deploy it. I know I kind of veered off a bit, but to kind of summarize or to directly give you the back of the box version answer to your question is for all force training, for every force training, we're always looking at officers to look at the totality of the circumstances and pull from their tool bag the best tool that's available. And that's considering a lot of things. And it's just that when it comes to life threatening or having to use lethal force, the immediacy of a threat and the severity of a threat is always going to kind of jump to the top of that decision-making process. Hopefully that was helpful and answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Lieutenant Toribio. I wonder if you could tell us I'm sorry you're not feeling well, but whether or how, if the policy were to change in this way, to say that commanders and officers shall make efforts to ascertain the presence of minors and vulnerable populations, how that might change either the deployment in either policy and procedure or the manner in which you train.
Sure. So with this now specific in policy, who we're encountering, the occupants around or the presence of people around, it's always a consideration, but codifying this now in policy just makes us kind of ensure that we're touching on it in training. So just offhand, how I'm seeing this employed in training is giving scenarios in which we introduce vulnerable populations into the scenario and then see what the PRO's thinking is when they're deploying, if they're not even considering it, if they're simply being dismissive of it, if they're now thinking about different tactics in which we can de-escalate as a result of having these populations present. So that in terms of training, that's kind of how I see it. I see it playing out. Schools that we run, they're always going to be a learning block that is heavily focused on what the policy is. And so now with this codified, it kind of gives the patrol rifle instructor staff cause to implement this point specifically more into training and have it play into the decision-making process. Kind of tangential effects of this, in me being a patrol procedures instructor and excuse me, assisting with teaching response to critical incidents. It's just another point to bring up as a consideration for field supervisors and commanders who are running critical incidents now to consider these vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Mr. Lindsay Poland.
There are a couple hands up in the public. I don't know if you want to take those first, or shall I go?
You want to go first or after them?
After.
Okay. Okay, members of the public with their hands up. Let me start with, there are two hands up, Leilani and Eleanor Levine. I'll go with Eleanor Levine because they have not yet talked. Eleanor Levine, I'm giving you permission to talk.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate all the work that you've been doing, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I haven't been able to attend all of the meetings and all of the totality of the meetings. I just have a question, part of which got answered, but is this use of force applied to children as well? Is there an age limit that the whole use of force policy has?
I'll refer that question to a member of the department. Lieutenant Turner.
Yes, thank you. So there is no age limit specifically on force, though it is an important consideration when you're looking at the totality of the circumstances. Certain force options do have age limits or extra considerations when we are talking about either the very young or the elderly, depending. But no, force is about the that engaged person and the threat or resistance that they pose. Now, of course, the thing is that with age, that typically can, especially people who are very young or very old, limit or almost eliminate the amount of resistance or threat that person can pose, making it unreasonable to use force on them.
Okay, thank you. I just, with all this discussion of vulnerable populations, that occurred to me. Thank you. I'll take my hand down.
Thank you so much for your question. Mr. Lindsay Poland.
So I was listening to Lieutenant Toribio and also thinking about what Jennifer Tu said earlier about these things are deployed when there's a serious threat to public safety, which is how I understood what Lieutenant Toribio was saying about the criterion for use. Maybe if you can scroll up, I don't know that is necessarily part of what is now like there's the factors to consider, but then what is the situation that authorizes use? So there's the body armor question, there's the person is known or suspected to possess a deadly weapon or firearm. I've seen patrol rifles deployed in my neighborhood when these conditions did not exist. And so I guess I'm wondering whether whether there needs to be a criterion of like that there is a, not just that the engaged person is, I mean, that's perhaps a good criterion, but I've seen them deployed when that condition did not exist. When the officers present said, no, the person's not armed, no, there was no known threat, and the person had broken in, and the officers went into the building with their patrol rifles out and pointed. So I guess I'm just wrestling with whether there really does need to be something that says, I mean, if these are the only, those situations are the body armor, the person is known or suspected to have a deadly weapon. If those are the only ones, authorized uses, then that's fairly restrictive. I kind of think that's reasonable set of criteria, but I suspect also that it's not what the department is currently using, because I've seen something different. So yeah, I'm just kind of wrestling with that.
Lieutenant Toribio.
Thank you. So those points aren't criteria for when we deploy their considerations. And yeah, there are several times where it's unknown where we're going to deploy that as a tool. So if an example would be a commercial burglary, for example, or even a residential burglary, where we know through experience and through training that, you know, burglars often are armed. They have tools that can be used as weapons, or you know, makeshift weapons, and anything that's inside the residence or in the business that we're unaware of or unfamiliar with can be used as weapons against officers. So it's going to be a standard procedure if we're doing. I'm trying to think of a term, or just plain English. So if we're going to be searching a building or a residence where there's a potential burglar inside, we're going to have our weapons drawn. And if we believe that there are going to be circumstances in which the rifle may be a tool that gives us a tactical advantage because of distance, then we're gonna have that deployed. So there may not be specific known intelligence that there is a person that has, you know, a firearm that's inside here. We're still going to deploy because just of the severity of it. You know, we wouldn't want officers to go inside and search without their guns drawn or without the best tool possible to address a potential threat. So that'd be a reason why. And just like we wouldn't just let somebody go in back into their business, back into their residence, without us clearing it for them and ensuring that it's safe for them to go back in.
This too.
I'm wondering what would happen in a situation like what Mr. Lindsay Poland just described, of he's in his neighborhood. There's a reported, I think it was a commercial burglary, supposedly, and there were vulnerable populations present. What kind of, like, I know this is a very hypothetical situation, but I'm wondering what kind of alternatives would be possible?
So there are a few alternatives that are possible and kind of go along in with the department's de-escalation, you know, sort of framework. So we might at first, as you know, as Lieutenant Trivio kind of stated, one of the things that's in the consideration of the initial responding officers is public safety, their safety, what the tool is that's going to achieve that. When we, you know, as we start looking at, and it becomes more reasonable to make some of these decisions or considerations, and we might say, for instance, move the designated arrest team or the dedicated arrest team to a different location. So on a commercial burglary, a large building where there are multiple entrances, if one entrance, say, is near a school, we might shift the focus of our efforts to safely detain any persons involved to a back entrance where, say, children were not immediately present, or something like that. There's going to be decisions made by the incident commander about perhaps gathering additional intelligence, or what our posture is going to be around disengagement, or how much we are going to search, what types of tools we are going to use, things of that nature. So there are perhaps force alternatives or ways that we might use some tools. And a lot of these are going to be based on the information that we have, the information that's developed. And then, you know, sometimes there are, as we noted, a lot of uncertainties and unknowns.
Lieutenant Toribio.
Thank you. So there are some things that we do by virtue of almost process now. And it because it's part of a process, it doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily associate what we're doing to, oh, that we're doing this because of a vulnerable population is present. And what I mean by that is, go back a few years ago, and we have a residential burglary and that their neighbors outside looking and their children looking, and we ask them to go inside for their safety, but people are looking, and what we would do is we would have a rifleman gather up and then go and then clear that residence. Instead, what we do now is we keep everybody behind cover, and we get other tools to go to potentially clear an area first. So we'll send a drone or we'll send a robot. So before we even have like riflemen going into a place, we do other things to try to de-escalate prior to even getting to that step first, right? Give announcements over a loudspeaker, have our air support unit give announcements so it can be heard from different angles or from a different perspective. So we kind of have built in, just by natural processes that we've established in patrol for a response to a critical incident, that does things to like alleviate us immediately, just like going in with the rifle.
Give me 1 sec. I'm going to share my screen. Yep. On the left is DGO K6 and the introductory statements. On the right is DGO K3, the use of force policy, specifically H, which discusses lethal force. I think I have said many times that the current policy that we're working on, K6, must be looked at in conjunction with K3, which is the department's use of force policy, with the principles of de-escalation. But I'm calling out specifically here, the way we wrote this was in policy section 3B, discharge and or deployment of a department rifle shall be in accordance with the provisions of K3 use of force or K5 tactical operations team. The tactical operations portion is not what we're looking at here. When you go to K3 and you look at lethal force, which is what we're talking about, an assault rifle, H2, drawing, exhibiting, or unholstering firearms. This is the principle for drawing. When the officer reasonably believes it is necessary for his or her own safety or the safety of others. This H3 is pointing. Objectively reasonable perception of a substantial risk that may escalate to justify lethal force. And H4 is the circumstances in which there is discharge. These are the baseline principles. On top of that, we have the further limitations that are put on patrol rifle officers by K6 and the considerations that are there. So to the extent that we're talking about when authorized deployments, these two policies in conjunction, since there is specific reference to them in 3B, kind of give you your, I suppose, your order of operations. In my mind, I am not a person who does these findings or investigates it, but the first step is whether the officer reasonably believes it's necessary for his or her own safety or the safety of others. And then when it's a patrol rifle officer, they have their additional considerations. Once all of those have been hit, then they can draw their patrol rifle. Does that sound about right, Lieutenant Turabeel, Lieutenant Turner?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So those are the principles that are at play here.
So what I heard Lieutenant Toribio say is that with the difference between the other firearms and the rifle is distance and accuracy. Is there in the rifle policy a criterion for deployment that, like when you're saying, okay, first you meet the criterion for drawing, exhibiting, or unholstering, and then you look at the rifle criteria. Is there a rifle criteria that says there needs to be an advantage for distance and accuracy in order to deploy the rifle?
There is a stipulation, a consideration that it's deployed when the threat or potential threat, I'm paraphrasing, but is beyond the effective range of a pistol and or shotgun. This was something that was discussed at length earlier in the ad hoc for this. And we even added what the rough estimate distance is for what's considered effective, although it's not definitive. But yeah, it's listed here in the policy.
So under authorized deployment, paragraph 1, second sentence, deploying members must be able to articulate how deployment provides that distinct tactical advantage. That was what Lieutenant Toribio was talking about. It makes another reference to K3 to sort of get the standard from K3 into the K6 policy. With the proviso that must understand deployment can be seen as perceived as threatening, intimidating, etc. That is also a pull from K3. Reiterates the commitment to de-escalation tactics, and then goes down to B, which is the factors in consideration. That's how those sort of play out there. And that's where we get into these considerations. The first three are the tactical advantage, the key pieces for what the tactical advantage may be. And we are adding on an additional, what we're looking at here is the additional factors of factor number 4, which are not actually here, but in that working document I have in on the other page.
Okay, I'm complete on that question, as President Bass would say.
We got there. We got there. All right. All right. So I think that was still useful. I think it's something that I've tried to say many times, but you know, gotta sort of pull out and get to those places. So back to the question at hand. I hear consensus among the commissioners, I will tell you this right now, of alternative 1 and making it shall make reasonable efforts to ascertain the presence of minors, the elderly, medically compromised people, and then reasonable efforts to avoid the deployment of patrol rifles in the immediate presence, of course, recognizing that there are other factors at play prior to the actual deployment of the rifles. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Can you repeat the first part again, Jesse?
Sure. Commanders and officers shall make, well, I hear consensus on commanders and officers shall make reasonable efforts to ascertain the presence of minors, the elderly, medically compromised people, people with physical, mental, or intellectual disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, or other vulnerable people as defined in DGO K03. And if present, commanders and officers shall make reasonable efforts to avoid the deployment of patrol rifles in the immediate presence of the above people. Miss 2.
I'm comfortable with this, given the discussion we just had. I think that was really valuable to dig in. So thank you all for taking that extra time. One thing I'm wondering is if any of this could get better reflected in the annual use report, just to make it a little bit more transparent to the public that those efforts are happening, and those considerations of whether the patrol rifle would offer that distance and accuracy is going into decisions.
I will second that. I do think it makes a lot of sense, especially when the annual report comes out, because that is what either city council or the commission will be looking at when they're making decisions about whether or not to continue the authorization for particular pieces of militarized equipment. what exactly those limitations might be. I do know that as part of this particular policy, there will also be tracking, and for each patrol rifle deployment, perhaps Lieutenant Toribio can tell us how that data or what that data captures.
Yes, so presently, data that is captured when a patrol rifle officer deploys is the incident and report number or report number that's generated, or rather incident and, if applicable, report number, the date and time, the location to include the police area, and then the reason for the deployment. That is what is documented when a rifle officer deploys. When the rifle is deployed in conjunction with a tactical team operation, or any time an armored vehicle is deployed, there's a laundry list of additional things that are reported. Now that the reporting is set to change. Presently now, it is individual deployments are gathered at training. When a patrol rifle comes to training, the patrol rifle instructor staff takes their logbook and pulls all the data, puts it on a master spreadsheet. That is changing shortly to being deployed through Vision, which is a excuse me, a larger, more comprehensive data management program. I don't know, and I see Lieutenant Febble has his hand up. If the data that is collected through Vision is more expansive than what I just laid out. So I'll kind of pass the baton over to Lieutenant Febble.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so just for everybody here, it captures all the data outlined by Lieutenant Toribio. In addition to, it obviously comports with the requirements of the latest municipal code, as well as state law, to include race, gender, and the location of those persons who are immediately subject to the deployment. So that data that Ms. Tu referenced will be captured on the new system.
Help us out. I want to get right to the point that Ms. Tu was trying to ask. Is the reason for deployment going to get to these tactical advantage pieces that we've been talking about?
So yes, it has every deployment of the rifle in the field for use. There is a justification section specific to that officer's deployment that they shall fill out every time that occurs.
Does that include distance, body armor, or armed, or just a general statement of the reason for deployment?
So it's a general statement of the reason for deployment. And of course, obviously with the new policy, officers will be required to input the information as necessitated by the new policy and open municipal code.
Lieutenant Toribio, with this particular new policy, will your officers be logging one of the three considerations that we have in the policy?
Yeah, typically what ends up being included is the specific reason for the tactical advantage. It's sometimes shorthanded and interpreted, so they'll say shooting suspect, right? Excuse me. So the implication is that the person is armed. Now there may be instances where what isn't specifically stated in policy is like a burglary suspect. So they'll write that they conducted a search for a burglary suspect. So it's pretty general, and it's inferred through something like a burglary or search, or commercial building search for burglary. It's just kind of known or implied that, the dangerous nature of a burglary. So it may not specifically hit on one of the three things if it's still a factor under which, or if it's still a reason we would deploy that falls out of one of those specific considerations. Because I don't think it specifically says burglary there. Although I guess it's implied that it's suspected that the person is armed. So roundabout way, yeah, it's covered in one of those three things. Sorry for kind of a little stream of consciousness explanation there, but yes, it's covered.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that means we're probably going to end up with alternative one. Again, any thoughts, comments, or suggestions or questions from anybody?
I do have a concern. I know that this was a significant topic of discussion last meeting. I just feel that, my opinion only, that the persons on scene or the commander shall make every attempt to identify persons on scene. I know Lieutenant Toribio is a subject matter expert, as well as Lieutenant Turner. I just don't see this as practical in the field.
Lieutenant Febel, can I stop you there?
Yes, sir.
Alternative one now says commanders and officers shall make reasonable efforts to ascertain the presence.
Okay, yeah, I do apologize. I was on another meeting prior to this, so that sounds good. Thank you very much for that clarity.
No problem. Thoughts, comments, suggestions? I'm going to take this one last comment from Rachel Beck, because she has been here all the way through all of these meetings.
Thanks so much. I'm wondering if the reporting will capture the reasonable efforts that were taken to avoid the deployment in a case where a deployment continues despite the presence of minors, the elderly, etc. Thank you.
Lieutenant Toribio, good question.
Sorry, I had to step away for a second. No, presently it does not include that. I don't believe that there are any plans at this point to do that.
Moving forward with the policy as it will likely be written. Lieutenant Turner.
So yeah, when policy like this, where there is a requirement for reasonable efforts to be made, the typical way that we teach officers, and not necessarily in the so understand that the things that Lieutenant Toribio and Lieutenant Febel are talking about is the data capture that to make data capture work for you, to look at these larger trends. Sometimes you do have to shorten down that. However, with a policy requirement, the typical way that we teach officers, commanders, any police personnel to document their either compliance with the policy requirement or deviation from that policy requirement is in the police report or whatever report it is. So yes, they will be documenting likely in their police reports if, for instance, they did ascertain the presence of a vulnerable population, yet continued why that was, very similar to how they would justify a use of force or something of that nature.
Much appreciated. All right. I think that takes care of all the city council proposed resolution amendments. Is everyone okay if we turn to some of the amendments that are proposed by Council Member Ramachandran? All right. Let's turn to specialty impact. That is 3-P. I think
H.
Maybe it's H. I have it. Let's see. That's rifles. That's duty aerosol. 3H. Yes. 3H. Let me see if I can get us all in the same place. 14. Okay, so 3H under deployment considerations. Sorry, I'm going to dual screen here so that we also have the actual policy up. Where's deployment considerations? Prohibited uses, deployment considerations, okay. So we are looking at very similar language to what we just were talking about, but this time in the realm of specialty impact munitions. This would, I don't think it would just replace what is already there, because the three populations called out have very specific language in there. I'll talk a little bit about it, but I don't know, maybe it depends on where we all land. Let's start with the department.
I think if there is a need to have this language, I would say likely first the department probably believes that as written, as the document that was proposed to council is sufficient. However, if there is a need to further codify these sorts of considerations around use of these tools in the presence of vulnerable populations, that we simply copy and paste the language that we just used in the rifle policy.
Could the department help us out a little bit with how y'all came to these three specific populations for deployment considerations? Was it when I go through them, it feels like these are populations where some sort of physical force that is used that maybe would not be so severe for a person not in these populations is actually more severe than normal. Is it that, or is there some other consideration there?
Yeah, that is, I believe, that the main consideration we're looking at is the severity vis-a-vis those specific populations.
And remind me about these specialty impact munitions. They're the launcher, the carrier, whatever it is it just, are we just talking about the orange shotgun, or are there others?
Yeah, we do have the 12 gauge shotgun that can be either orange or it can be, in the patrol situation, it can be black, standard issue black. We also do have these, and especially for crowd control, where we are banned by law and policy from using those 12 gauge. We instead use a 40 millimeter launcher. So it is a black, looks like a launcher. It is very clear that it is a weapon.
When you say it very much looks like a launcher, because I'm a civilian, sorry, is it bigger than a shotgun?
Yeah, so it's about the same in terms of man portability or person portability. From the perspective of looking at the person, it's carrying like a shoulder fired weapon, rifle, shotgun, something like that. It is a little bit larger in terms of the barrel. So the barrel is larger if looking down it. Hopefully most people do not have that experience. And it is something where it's probably a little bit shorter than a shotgun. Typically these launchers break at the action. So they are 1 round launchers. I think we did and do continue to have some of the multi-launchers, however. So those are much larger, and they'll have, say, 6 barrels where each one could have a projectile. Those from my admittedly dated experience with them, they were unreliable. And so we typically only use the single launcher.
Mr. Lindsay Poland.
So hearing Lieutenant Turner say that the language that we just adopted that includes commanders and officers, make every reasonable effort or make reasonable efforts. If that were added So that's like, I guess that would be right under 1 before you get to A, B, and C. So it adds, it also adds the people with limited English proficiency, and other vulnerable people. I mean, if the department is comfortable with adding that with the adjustments that we've just made with the rifle policy, I think sounds like a good solution.
Commissioner, Vice Chair.
I'm not advocating against copying and pasting that language. I think it's good language. Although I do want to note that the two weapons we're discussing are different. And I think the as we discussed, the thinking around why this language was included initially in this policy is not necessarily the same thinking that we are applying to the patrol rifle. The launcher and or the shotgun, either of those less lethal launchers become potentially less lethal if used upon one of this population. And so I think that is why we're noting it as like it is potentially significantly more harmful to a group, somebody who is medically compromised, a child or a senior citizen, than it would be to say somebody who doesn't speak English. And I think it's important that we note that that's the reason why that language is there. I don't know if copy and pasting that language over captures that. Maybe it covers it and we can just say, but I also think that, like, you know, if we're talking about the utilization of less than lethal weapons, in some ways we want, if it is not a bystander, we're worried about sort of the presence of a launcher being sort of triggering or harmful to a bystander, especially somebody with mental health challenges. But it is instead somebody who is the subject of the deployment of the launcher. Ideally, nobody gets hit with a less than lethal option at all, but that is preferable to say, I mean, if we're thinking about the language we just looked at, one of those step backs from the patrol rifle would be a less than lethal launcher, right? And so we're saying, okay, this person is, decompensated. They have mental health challenges. We are not going to use deploy a patrol rifle in this situation, though they have a knife and they are potentially capable of deadly force themselves. You're going to deploy a beanbag instead. But then this language basically says, but also don't deploy beanbags if there are people with mental health challenges. I get it. I'm not advocating for shooting people with mental health challenges with beanbags. Far from it. But I also want to point out the sort of inherent sort of logical sort of knot we're tying ourselves in here by not acknowledging the sort of different reasoning between the two different policy languages. So we should be cognizant of that.
Before I get the next hand, I just want to call out two things. One, we do have in the next pages here under what is currently number 2. I know it's very small, so what I did was I pulled out relevant pieces on the right side of your screen in the live edits document. The considerations that members need to do, and it says members shall, absent exigent circumstances, consider the following factors. And I've called out ones that seem relevant to this particular discussion. Specifically, are there any language or hearing barriers that affect the engaged person's ability to comprehend clear and articulate communication and directions from members? Is the engaged person under the influence of medication, illegal drugs, or an intoxicant? Does the engaged person have any mental or psychological impairment? What is the age of the engaged person, and does their age factor into the level of resistance? the engaged person is posing or the immediacy of the threat they present. And it strikes me that the deployment considerations mainly focus on the person under whom the sim is envisioned or is proposed to be used against. On that note, Miss 2.
Thanks. I kind of want to follow this direction you're going in, and I wonder if you could scroll us up to the purpose in the document on the left. Thank you. Oh, thanks. That makes it even easier. So I read that sims are used to interrupt an engaged person's threatening behavior. And what I'm wondering is if the purpose is to interrupt, or if the purpose is to dissuade. And the reason that I'm thinking about this is when there are populations that can't make the rapid associations that you might expect from someone who is fully able-bodied and fluent in English. I wonder about the use of these weapons. If someone doesn't understand English, then how does it help de-escalate? How does it help communicate what an officer's desired behavior change out of that person is? And then the other thing I'm thinking about is part of the reason for someone wanting to use one of these less lethal weapons is because the potential for lethality is less than other weapons, and that can change depending on the person. So if someone is much smaller, if it's a child, there are different factors that go in that would change the amount of the amount of effect on that person. And I'm wondering if it would be helpful to think about what we want to change with those things, and also what was just raised in mind. And so that's would a change in policy make it so that weapons aren't deployed when there's no connection with someone's ability to comply? If someone does not speak English, it's going to be challenging for them to comply with any kind of verbal orders. Is there any way we can add additional protection to people who would be impacted more severely than other people? And the third is about that, what you just said of, is it the subject, the person who is being targeted, or is it the presence of others?
Let's take a this piece by piece. The beanbag shotguns. There are both the ones that are in orange, and there are also the ones that are in the patrol black. From a bystander perspective, would the black patrol less lethal shotgun look any different than a live or regular shotgun? Lieutenant Toribio.
Okay, so I think it's better phrased when referring to a shotgun. It's the munition itself. The shotgun is the carrier for the munition. So orange shotguns and the black patrol shotguns, the only difference between those are the actual color. So both are capable of firing 12 gauge rounds, whether they're lethal ammunition or less lethal ammunition. The purpose for color coding it orange is just to advise personnel that only less lethal ammunition should be loaded into it. But in the field, an officer, when they get their shotgun ready for duty and they load it in the patrol vehicle, the standard is that they load it with live ammunition, lethal ammunition. And then if needed, they unload and then load less lethal ammunition. And there are safeguards in place. There's an entire process that involves two officers and a safety check of both the mechanism, the shotgun, and the rounds itself, and ensuring that there are no lethal rounds on the person who will be utilizing the shotgun in a less lethal capacity. So hopefully that clears things up. When we refer to like less lethal shotgun, we're referring to the actual munitions and not the shotgun itself.
The next question I have is whether the launcher is ever used in standard, I guess there's not really a standard, but in patrol operations or operations other than crowd control.
They are only right now, the only people who are certified to use launchers are members of the tactical team, and even more particular, the entry and the sniper element. They are deployed. So it can become a question of semantics, but during, for example, sideshow operations, I would consider sideshow to be different than a crowd control situation. Like a demonstration that becomes riotous, for example, I consider that a different type of incident and different type of response in turn than a sideshow incident. But we deploy members of a tactical team as a contingent during sideshow operations, and they're also equipped with a 40 millimeter launcher. They're not like standard issued. They're not something that any officer can check out. They're only deployed by tactical team operators. If I could add, I do not know if operators who are trained are using them in their assignment. I don't believe I've heard of any instance in which it's been used in patrol or by patrol, but there are, for example, there's our ceasefire team, there's our violent crimes operations center team, and there are members of our tactical team who are there, and they do much more in-depth planning in operations. And I don't know if they've used the 40 millimeter as like a tool during those operations. So I'm not, and they would be deploying in the field, but not patrol. Never seen the 40 millimeter deployed in patrol.
So I'm a little lost. I'm not sure whether we're considering the first piece or what's in front of the screen right now the reframing that you did, Jesse. I'm a little lost as to like what it is we're actually considering.
Sorry. So the this was the original language in the proposal. This is the, if we do choose to go down this route of having additional considerations of sort of the presence of other people around in the immediate presence or in the area, what that language might look like if we're doing this. Sorry. Highlighted is the original language. The language that is below is our language from above that we just talked about and working through patrol rifles. And what I'm trying to flesh out is whether, well, a couple of things. One is, does it make sense to have this additional piece, this additional paragraph, when the difference between whether or not less lethal is loaded or not is really just changing the ammo inside of a shotgun that doesn't have the same limitation? And two, the extent to which the launcher is used in standard operations. So, going back to Commissioner Jordan's vice chair's point, the patrol rifles are used or can be used much more commonly and much more often and are much more visible as very large assault weapons, as opposed to shotguns that just many OPD officers are issued. And whether, because there are many that they are issued, there's no way to actually tell, or no additional effect on these populations, when they might not even be able to tell there are specialty impact munitions, as opposed to just a shotgun being pulled out that we don't have this language for. And then for the launchers piece is how often, how, in what situations, and whether or not. And it kind of sounds like it's restricted to tactical team operations and crowd control, which would have their own considerations anyways and limitations. Just trying to flesh that out so that we have all the information. Vice Chair.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So this policy specific, is this specifically covering the launcher or the munition? It is specifically controlling the sim, right? So what we're really talking about here is not necessarily whatever tool is being used to use a less lethal sim round, but specifically the round itself. And I recognize that the launchers can be a sort of focus of concern, specifically the 40 millimeter launcher. I assume you can just Google 40 millimeter launcher and image search it, and you can see what it looks like. That's not a thing you want pointed at you. But that said, what we're talking about, what this language really covers, is not the launcher, but the round, the munition. And so we have to sort of keep our thinking sort of, unless we want to expand this to launchers. But that is a different ball of wax, unless I'm wrong, and this policy is in fact has language specifically to launchers as well as, or maybe there's a different policy for launchers. I don't know.
Lieutenant Turner, Lieutenant Toribio.
I see what Vice Chair is saying, that in just the caveat with the 40 millimeter is, well, to go back, yes, we are talking about the munitions, but the caveat with the 40 millimeter munition is when you're going with that, in tandem with it comes the launcher. So shotgun, okay, if there isn't language already for deployment of the shotgun, the munition is almost incidental. But with the 40 millimeter in tandem with that larger foam round, or with a chemical or smoke agent, excuse me, that's being deployed, you are going to get a separate firing system now that is introduced into public view, and then in turn presence of vulnerable populations.
So we are in essence really thinking about kind of two separate things here in some ways, because that initial language that we first looked at, that was sort of potentially going to be supplanted by the recommended language from city council member, it doesn't necessarily differentiate. We are like, one of those things is talking about not wanting to use less than lethals on folks for whom a less than lethal could be lethal. The other is acknowledging that, like, yes, that is the case for munitions fired from a 40 millimeter, but then we also have the same problem, or a similar problem, that we have perceptionally around the patrol rifles, how that is potentially triggering and problematic for folks, and what that means. And those are kind of two different issues, which I mean, I don't have the answer off the top of my head as to sort of, but I think it's important to define our terms and really be thinking about how we're applying this language to them. Is it actually solving the problem we seek to solve?
Sir Lindsay Poland.
So in the current proposed policy, there are these three very specific populations where there's guidance given. And then the proposed language, as Commissioner Jordan said, have a wider set of categories. I wonder that I think is helpful here, especially since a lot of this is with the tactical team, where these things are being deployed, perhaps in serving a warrant or in some other kind of operation, is the effort to ascertain the presence. So there's a call out, the person doesn't come out, they want to use the 40 millimeter to break the window in order to, send in something. If you break the window with the 40 millimeter and you've got any of these populations here, it could be pretty bad. I mean, maybe they didn't call out because of the English proficiency, not because, so if the 40 millimeter or the, were used and it had this effect on people who are more physically vulnerable, yes, that's a real problem. But then I think the addition of these other categories of people is about whether using this weapon is going to achieve what the department wants to achieve. And in comparison with the harm that it could do. So, and I hear you in terms of saying, okay, deployment in the presence of is a big category. If the effort is made to ascertain the presence, and I keep thinking about pre-planned operations where there's people in the home, then the reasonable efforts to avoid might not be the deployment, it might be the firing. So, or, I mean, it might also be, okay, you're able to do the operation another time when those people are not there. And the person you are seeking is there, or the other contingencies that the Commissioner Jordan suggested earlier. So I'm thinking that this language, in addition to the three populations where there's some specific guidance about deployment. And then here you have this like, okay, and you want to know who's there. And if you find out that any of these people are there, reasonable efforts to avoid firing should be made.
Sorry, can I just, I hear what you're saying, but I also want to note that as Commissioner Shea mentioned, further down in this policy, there is actually guidance around identifying any of those, sorry, my child is having a temper tantrum downstairs and just as I'm talking, bedtime. Bedtime is always rough. That there is guidance already built into this policy around safeguarding vulnerable populations. Do you not feel like that's sufficient, or maybe that's where we modify it? Is that other language further down, maybe strengthen that as opposed to.
Can we go down below to there? Because what I was thinking or remembering was that it didn't include the same list of people.
Right side under number 3, I've called out the specific ones that are relevant to the list.
So this doesn't say shall make efforts to ascertain. It just says shall consider. So again, the intelligence gathering part is kind of missing.
So then do we just build in that specific language around, like, make efforts to ascertain? And then this sort of functions very much like the language that we put into the previous policy, into the patrol rifle policy. No?
I think, I'm not sure which, when you say this, what you're referring to.
Sorry, that part that's further down, that's sort of enumerating the potential risks. So language, hearing barriers, under the influence, mental health. So it's saying members shall, absent exigent circumstances, consider the following factors. Maybe we build in a little bit of language in this piece. Consider following factors, and make a reasonable effort to ascertain if X, right? I mean, I think that what we have is it is formatted differently, but the intentionality is actually pretty similar, because they're saying you should, people utilizing this less than lethal weapon should seek to, it's not saying seek to identify, but it is actually saying, consider is I think the real, pivotal thing there. If we want to draw it more in line with what we just did, but perhaps we, I actually think this is in some ways, this is maybe even more specific than what we put into the previous policy.
I just think efforts to ascertain is proactive. It's this, you can consider, but there's a kind of a proactive response.
We're also at time, just noting.
I am a little bit less worried about time here, because this is the list from Councilmember Ramachandran as opposed to the list from the full council. There's still, I think they still require and deserve the full amount of attention that these ideas bring. But I am more okay with stopping at 8 o'clock for this set. So I think because of its Commissioner Jackson Castaigne.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest, kind of going back to Lieutenant Turner's suggestion, is that we just include the same language that we just developed. I think it's important for consistency, and I think the spirit of what her comments are also captured in that statement, and I think it's sufficient.
I don't disagree that the language works and we should maybe work to seek to work it in. I guess my concern is I don't want to replace the language that's there, because the language that's there it has a different purpose. It is to say, let's not use less lethal rounds on pregnant women, children, senior citizens, or physically disabled people because they potentially are not less lethal, which is a different intention potentially than what we are building into patrol rifles. If we want to do that, I think we should definitely, make clear that this other thing is here for a specific reason.
For clarity purposes, the proposal was not to replace them, just to add.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Then
No worries.
I'll shut up. I want to go anyway, so I'm gonna stop talking.
Okay. Like I said, I am a little bit less concerned about the speed of which this is done. I think these ideas are and should be fairly sort of thought through and done purposefully. I am not going to ask people to come back next week though, especially because we have our commission meeting this Thursday, and then the next one will be on the 9th. And so I think for our purposes, we can put forward to the commission I-26, K7, and K6. I'll have those revisions drafted up, and then we can turn back on February 6th, I think is our next scheduled, if we go with every other week, which would give us the turnaround for the February 9th commission meeting. And frankly, you know what? I think we have plenty to talk about for Thursday anyways. So thank you all for your time. As always, very much appreciate everyone and their willingness to come, share ideas, and talk through these issues and give us information. I apologize to council. I did not get everything done, but we did what we could, and we're working through as best as we can with all deliberate speed. Thank you all. I'll see you all on February 6th if I don't see you at the commission meeting on Thursday. Have a good night.
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.